Thank you, Victor. And hello, everyone. Heartfelt thanks to all of you intrepid educators. You're living examples of the belief that education is a lifelong process and that learning comes from all sorts of sources. This is something that I didn't have as a child growing up in Chicago right out of a World War II internment camp. My first week of second grade at Gowdy Grammar School in Chicago, Illinois, I was asked where I had come from. Camp, I said. Girl Scout camp? Asked Betsy O'Reilly, who became my best friend. So now, let me start at the beginning. My name is Shirley Sadayo Nikki Nojima Lewis. It sometimes feels like a string of aliases. Shirley because my immigrant mother named me after Shirley Temple, the most popular child movie star of the 1930s. Sadayo because that's my Japanese name. Don't ask me what it means. I've never seen the actual Japanese characters for that name, so I'm not really able to identify its meaning. I'm sure it means something splendid, though. After all, I'm a child named after Shirley Temple. Nojima, because it's my father's family name, a samurai family from the region of Tokyo. And Nikki, because finally in fourth grade, when all of my school buddies were calling each other nicknames, I got the name of Nikojima after Nojima, and which eventually ended up being Nikki, something my mother could finally pronounce. So I've been Nikki for a very long time, and it's my professional writing name. Now, Lewis is my married name, and that, like so many American immigrant stories, is based on a mistake. When the immigration officer asked Grandpa Lou from China what his name was, he heard it as Louis. So there you go. Another immigrant story and a new identity. But that's the Chinese American side of my family, another story. Days of spacious dreams, I sailed for America, overblown with hope, overblown with hope. Those are the words by a Japanese poet that represent the American dream of countless immigrants. American dreams that sometimes turned into American nightmares. My family's stories and the stories of about 120,000 people of Japanese ancestry are about American dreams and nightmares and American dreams lost and found. As an oral historian, playwright, and producer, I create living history presentations for the New Mexico Japanese American Citizens League, using oral history and multimedia readers' theater techniques to portray themes of social justice, the civil rights movement, peace, and the women's movement, and especially the Japanese American experience. So back to the beginning, as I said, I was born in Seattle, Washington on December 7th, 1937, the only child of immigrant parents from Japan. My mother and father had lived in the United States for years, but Asian exclusion laws had prevented them from becoming American citizens. On December 7th, 1941, the news came over the radio. The Japanese have bombed Pearl Harbor. What is Parahaba? My mother said. Later that day, after the birthday guests had left and we were preparing for bed, the doorbell chimed. Ding dong, ding dong, ding dong, ding dong, ding dong. Knocking, louder knocking, finally pounding. Daddy's in the bathroom. I am in the kitchen in my jammies, licking Neapolitan ice cream off of a spoon. The kitchen door swings open. A pink-faced man leans in. "What have we here?" he says, and he takes off his hat. His hair is the color of carrots. He walks in, opens the room closet, the pantry door, even the tiny door that holds the ironing board. And he goes out on the porch, leaving the back door wide open. Ooh, it's cold. When he comes back, he wipes his feet on the welcome mat. "Cute baby," he tells Mama. "I'm 4, I say." The man laughs, and he sounds nice. Another man is also in the house. He bangs on the bathroom door and talks in a loud voice. The toilet flushes, but Daddy doesn't come out. The other man is older than the one with carrot hair. He doesn't take off his brown hat. "Go around the side," he tells the younger man. "Check windows." Mommy says, "Shoichi, Shoichi." She talks to the bathroom door. "There are giants in our house." Daddy comes out of the bathroom. When he sees me, he puts a smile on his face. Mr. Brown Hat puts bracelets on him, and he and the carrot-haired man take my daddy away. We didn't hear from my father for almost a year. By that time, my mother and I, our friends and neighbors in Seattle, were in Camp Minidoka, in the lava lands of central Idaho. When at last we began hearing from him, my father was in a place called Santa Fe. His letters arrived in envelopes marked enemy alien mail, and they were censored. Sometimes whole columns of Japanese characters would be cut out of the thin sheets of letter paper. What I remember most about those days was sitting on the steps of my barracks, opening gift packages stamped enemy alien mail from Santa Fe, New Mexico. Inside would be Tootsie Rolls and Lifesavers and juicy fruit chewing gum, but best of all, Pueblo pottery and beaded jewelry, or one time, a little wooden Kachina doll. To me, New Mexico was a magical place. In my teaching, I use oral histories and multimedia readers' theater techniques, as I've told you in my introduction. To me, they create a tapestry of memories of the Japanese-American experience. For my first oral history play called Breaking the Silence, which was written in 1985, the author of Farewell to Manzanar, which many of you know and teach in your classes, Jean Wachowski Houston, gave me permission to use scenes from her book. This is a memoir, one of the first memoirs written by Jean, of her incarceration in Manzanar, high in the Sierra Nevadas, made famous by Ansel Adams and his iconic photographs. One scene in Farewell to Manzanar resonated with me years later when I visited the National Archives to look into my father's file. Like my dad, Jean Wachowski Houston's immigrant father had been picked up by the FBI almost immediately after the attack on Pearl Harbor and was taken to an army camp for interrogation. Who do you want to win the war? Who do you want to win the war? The interrogator repeatedly asked. As reported in my father's file, after repeated questioning, he answered, Japan is my country, but America is my daughter's country. I am sure America will win. I think it was my reply that kept my father incarcerated for almost a year after the war ended. The surrender was announced on August 15, 1945, yet my father wasn't released from the Santa Fe internment camp until June of 1946. That and the fact that my father's family were in Japan, and my grandfather was a judge, and my uncles members of the Japanese Imperial Navy. In Farewell to Manzanar, the angry father's reply to his interrogator was, Who do you want to win this war? Who do you want to win this war? When you're finally, Jean's father says, when your mother and father are having a fight, do you want them to kill each other, or do you just want them to stop fighting? When you walk through the National Archives in Washington, D.C., far above your head are carved the words from Shakespeare's The Tempest. What's past is prologue. Another quote that's brought to mind is the philosopher George Santayana's reminder that those who do not learn history are doomed to repeat it. So now I've been asked to tell you a little bit about Lordsburg, you teachers here in Las Cruces, a topic that's covered in this publication, Confinement in the Land of Enchantment, which Victor Yamada has told you about. Incidentally, this fall, the JCL players will be adapting stories from this book for a Reader's Theater program that will tour New Mexico. Now, Lordsburg was the first camp that my dad was sent to after the interrogation he had in Missoula, Montana, at an Army fort. Molly Pressler, who is the unofficial curator of the Lordsburg Museum, has a bunch of 3x5 cards that she carries in a plastic cake box whenever she gives a talk on Lordsburg. At one talk in 2012 at the New Mexico History Museum in Santa Fe, Molly asked if anybody in the audience knew of anyone who had been in Lordsburg. I raised my hand and said, Shoichi Nojima. She reached in her plastic cake box and took out one stack out of several alphabetically arranged stacks of 3x5 cards. She removed the rubber band and came up with my father's card, his name, his number, the date he had arrived, and the fact that he had $1 in his sweater pocket, the sweater that he had been wearing when he had been removed from our home on my 4th birthday, 70 plus years earlier. What I would like to read to you now is an excerpt from our reading at the Special Collections Library on February 17th, 2018, this year. 3 years ago, a man brought us a diary that had been kept in his attic for years. It had been written by his father-in-law, long deceased, and he and his other Issei men had been incarcerated in Lordsburg from 1942 to 43. This diary is entirely written in Japanese. So Sam Mihara, the man who brought the New Mexico JCL this diary, had long ago put it in his attic. He couldn't read Japanese. But one of our board members, who is from Hiroshima, translated portions of it with the help of a colleague. Incidentally, the the grandfather of the mayor of Las Cruces, Ken Miyagishima, was also held in Lordsburg during this time in World War II. Like my dad and the men who kept the diary of Lordsburg, they were Japanese men who had lived in the United States for many, many years and had fathered American children and were unable to become citizens because of Asian exclusion laws. The average age of these men in Lordsburg was 55. My father was at that time 54 years old. So now I will attempt a multiplicity of voices, of male voices, of the immigrant men who were imprisoned in Lordsburg. One man says in the diary that we translated, "We were men from many regions in the United States and territories of Hawaii and Alaska. I am sure that the endurance we showed in living through harsh conditions of this camp are because of the comfort and friendship we gave each other. At 1:45 on July 27, 1942, our train from Bismarck, North Dakota, arrived at Lordsburg with 147 men. We were met by armed American soldiers. The leader of transport group tells sergeant who meet us, we're handing over 147 internees, including 2 men who are sick. We get off train and stand in 3 rows at corner where guards are surrounding us. Sergeants tell sick men, you, step out of line. You too. You two wait here. A car is going to pick you up. A single guard was assigned to wait with them. One man looked very frail. Other had pronounced limp. They were close friends. Sergeant then orders rest of us to march. We march 15, 16 minutes. Hey, no car coming from camp to get sick men. How come? We keep looking back at train tracks, distance getting longer and longer. Well, they must have known about sick men. Why not they arrange beforehand to meet train? Are those men still standing on railroad tracks, waiting in dark, in middle of cold prairie? We finally reach entry of camp at 3 a.m. Then roll call taken by second lieutenant, and 145 of us, except 2 sick men, forced into wire-fenced camp. Soon after dawn, a story started that the 2 men who had been separated from us had been shot to death by a soldier, that the men had tried to escape. Well, we were stunned to hear this rumor because Mr. Kobata had been suffering from lung illness, and he had been in the hospital in Bismarck. Well, he had to be transported to the train on a stretcher. Oh, I remember. Mr. Isamura had damaged his spinal cord. Well, he fell from a fishing boat more than 10 years before. Well, he had much difficulty walking. He would walk 5-10 minutes, then have to stop. With such physical handicap, how could he have tried to escape? Other people came forward saying, I heard 2 gunshots during roll call last night. I heard 3 gunshots. My dream was shattered by gunfire. We vowed to find out the truth because we are fellow Japanese and we help each other during 6 months of confinement in Bismarck. 34 of us rushed to the dispensary. We learned that Mr. Isamura died instantly at scene, but Mr. Kobata died in infirmary at 5 a.m. They are both 57 or 58 years old. The officer who had done the shooting, Private First Class Clarence Burleson, was acquitted after testifying that he was following military protocol. In the summer of 1943, the Issei of Lordsburg were transferred to other camps, including Santa Fe. In 1944, Lordsburg imprisoned Italian and German POWs, which may have led to the assumption, still held today, that the Issei men who were held there earlier had been enemy Japanese soldiers captured in Japan. I've got to stop there because I don't have an ending to this. How long? Yes? What is your question?
Where did your father go after release from Santa Fe camp in New Mexico? And then where did your mother and you go after release from the Minidoka camp?
Where did my father go after release from Santa Fe, New Mexico? And where did my mother and I go after our release from Minidoka in Idaho? Well, I'll take the second question first because chronologically, my mother and I left our camp in Minidoka in 1945 when the war was still going on. Because if you had a sponsor, such as the Quakers or different church groups or civic groups, and went east of our internment sites, we were able to be released from camp. Given that we were not, we were cleared of any enemy alien status. So my mother and her 6.5-year-old daughter took off by train by the Santa Fe Railroad to Chicago, Illinois, which is where I grew up and remained until I was 16 years old when I returned to the Pacific Northwest to live with my dad. In 1946, in June of 46, as I said earlier, my father was released from Santa Fe. And although he tried to join us in Chicago, it didn't seem to work out. I remember crying and asking my mother why Daddy couldn't stay with us. And my mother said in her half English, half Japanese vocabulary that we used with one another, that look at your daddy. He is a gentleman. And the life here in Chicago is too rough for him. So my father returned to Seattle, Washington, where he was, for the rest of his life, a very beloved member of the Japanese community. And it was in 1954, when I was 16 years old, that I was notified that my father had had a heart attack in Seattle, and my mother said, go to Seattle and live with your dad. Consequently, I graduated from high school in Seattle, Washington, and have been more or less on the West Coast ever since. What that move did for me, if you know the poem, Two Roads Diverged in the Yellow Wood and I Took the One Less Traveled by Robert Frost, that made me into a Japanese American person. Because in Chicago, my mother and just a very, very few people who were Japanese American were familiar to me. And I wasn't interested in this side of my story at all. I remember my first hero after reading the diary of Anne Frank was Anne Frank. And I was much more Europeanized as a kid growing up in Chicago because I knew many European refugees from World War II. In fact, my piano teacher was the former conductor of the Vienna State Opera. So those Anne Frank stories were very meaningful to me, and I think I knew much more about the Holocaust at that time than I did of the Japanese American experience. So it was my move to the West Coast that led me to this path on which I've been for more than 30 years.
Would you take care of that?
I won't be able to catch it in time. Any other questions?
Yeah, even though it's out of sequence, did you talk about what your dad was doing in Seattle before pickup, what his occupation was? If you didn't, then take that as another question, and you can put up what sequence you want to. But so repeated my question is, so what was your dad's occupation before Pearl Harbor?
What's the name of that bilingual paper up in Seattle? I can never remember. That's who we worked for.
It's not Schiphol?
Yeah. It's still going. Yeah. But
well, your answer can probably be just that.
I'll just say it for a bilingual
yeah,
paper.
Japanese,
Okay. Okay.
I was hoping I could turn it off.
Huh?
I was hoping I could turn your phone off.
Well, I think that's the last supplemental question, so go ahead and repeat.
You want me to turn it off?
It might be a good idea.
Okay.
Since, we don't want to
Yeah.
be interrupted.
Right.
Probably,
Yeah, like the doorbell, like Kiku's
yeah,
door.
We should probably start just before that, if you could.
Kiku was giving a wonderful interview, and then Joan came late and knocked on the door, and then Kiko goes, huh? Like that.
Yeah, because basically the phone rang just before you ended that last topic.
Oh.
So she can repeat the last.
So, yeah,
Last paragraph.
the question would be to repeat the last paragraph.
The whole-
Then you ask your question.
But my answer is so long.
Well, but you only have to repeat the last paragraph for it, if you can remember. What was it,
Oh, how Europeanized I was?
Yeah, yeah.
Okay, so shall I just start with,
So just start with
in fact, I didn't know any Japanese people besides my mother?
yeah,
Something like,
and
okay,
yeah, we can pick up
yeah,
on that.
yeah.
And then you ask your question, or you can just pretend that he's asked it.
yeah, just pause for a few seconds and then say, another question was that, and then you can answer about.
Because
Okay.
it's ringing while you ask the question.
So what would the question be? In reply to the question,
Oh, yeah, go ahead and repeat your discussion about you feeling European and not being around too many Japanese Americans
Right.
in Chicago.
but that wasn't the question, you just asked what
No,
we,
no, what I'm saying is, you can repeat that paragraph and then pause for a few seconds, and then you can say that another question from the audience was,
okay,
what was your father doing as an occupation before Pearl Harbor?
okay. But you want me to repeat the last part of the Chicago story?
Yeah, I'm
Okay,
watching with the,
okay.
the part with Anne Frank or whatever.
Okay.
Yeah.
Okay, ready? So in reply to the question about our early life in Chicago after my mom and I left camp, actually, first of all, my mother refused to return to the West Coast, where my father eventually ended up. And she also didn't want to live around the Japanese community, which was mainly on the south side of Chicago, near the University of Chicago. And so I grew up on the north side in a Jewish neighborhood, part Jewish neighborhood, and then a lot of Southerners and Appalachians coming, to the industrial jobs in Chicago. The war was still on. This was 1945. And consequently, I was rather Europeanized. I actually knew a lot about the Holocaust, much more than I did about the Japanese-American experience. Because my piano teacher was the former conductor of the Vienna State Opera. And I also went to a Catholic ballet school. As I said, I lived in a partially Jewish neighborhood. The rest of the neighborhood were Caucasians from different ethnicities. A lot of my friends in grammar school had grandparents from Finland or Iceland. I met a lot of Scandinavians from Minnesota. I was practically adopted into the Catholic Irish family of my Girl Scout leader, and so forth and so on. So it wasn't until I was 16 years old and I was notified that my father in Seattle had had a heart attack, that my mother said, go to Seattle and live with your dad. So when my father was released from the hospital, I lived with him until his death 3 years later. So that reminds me that my time with my father was only the first 3 years of my life, because he was removed by the FBI on my 4th birthday, and then the last 3 years of his life, because I was 16 years old when I went to live with my dad, and he died from his final fatal heart attack when I was 19 years old. So I don't know very much about my parents' life before the war. As one of you have asked, what was my dad doing? I know that he worked for the bilingual newspaper, and that because he was educated, he had actually come to the United States to attend university. My father was born in 1888. And as I said, as expressed in that poem, Days of Spacious Dreams, I sailed for America overblown with hope. Both my parents really believed in the American dream. So my dad had remained in the United States. I suspect, this is my guess knowing a little bit about Japanese culture, that he relished the freedom of America. He did say that at one point. And he didn't have the kind of responsibilities he had as a son of a samurai family in Japan. And my mother also felt the same way. So that is part of that, one of those 120,000 Japanese American stories. So I'm stopping because I got off track. I forgot what I was answering.
You answered the question. What did your father do? So you did.
So he worked, okay. And I'm not sure how to wrap. Okay. So basically what I would like to end with is the fact that, the journey that we all take in our lives and living history. I'm with the New Mexico JCL, and I've been with many, many organizations and many arts groups. And for me, it's all about storytelling, story sharing. It's no accident that my first play on the Japanese American experience is called Breaking the Silence, because in 1985, when I wrote that play as a benefit for the civil liberties trial of Gordon Hirabayashi, many, many families had not told their children or their grandchildren about their camp experience. So at that time, also, there was very little research. There weren't a lot of books, as there are now, on this camp experience. And so when I wrote this play for Gordon Hirabayashi, who, if you don't know, was a young University of Washington sociology major in 1942 when World War II was declared and President Roosevelt signed Executive Order 9066. Gordon, who was a Quaker, and his Caucasian friend, who was an attorney, decided to test the constitutionality of Executive Order 9066. And he broke the curfew law, because the curfew law was all Japanese off the streets by 8 p.m. There's also another story that we present in our play of Min Yusui also breaking a curfew law to test the constitutionality of the executive order in Portland, Oregon. And another young man, these guys were all in their 20s, also testing constitutionality, Fred Korematsu, in California. So just without knowing what the other person was doing, these three men put themselves on the line. They each believed in the Constitution so fervently that they were sure that when their cases were appealed before the Supreme Court, that their cases that they would be vindicated. That failed, and they each served prison terms. But toward the end of their lives, in the late 1990s or in the 21st century, in 2012, I believe, Gordon Hirabayashi received a posthumous Presidential Medal of Freedom. Fred Korematsu got his Presidential Medal earlier, I think in the late 1990s. And just 2 years ago, while we were touring our play on Min Yusui in New Mexico, he also received a posthumous Presidential Medal of Freedom. So the reason I'm 80 years old and I'm still on the road and I'm still at this is because I'm highly conscious of the fact that I'm the last generation alive that experienced the camp. And to those to whom I present these stories, I would like you to meet somebody through direct contact or through our videos, through you're becoming acquainted with Kiku Kato in her 90s, and others that are still with us, that this story is very much an American story. It's a story that is your story as well, and it's a story about vigilance, about compassion, and about courage. Thank you very much.